So, hello, welcome back to the genealogy season of Core Enaction, the Core Enaction series. I'm sharing my slides. Okay, and so as usual, I would like to briefly introduce the session by recapitulating the path we accomplished so far. A path that started with an introductive session dedicated to offer an overview of the itinerary of our genealogical exploration of Enaction. Then we had two sessions dedicated to the cybernetic origins of Enaction through lectures by Professor Bruno Clark and Professor Juan Carlos Letelier. Then we had other two sessions on autopoiesis, based on one lecture by Professor Thompson and the second lecture by Professor Juan Carlos Letelier. And this evening, we are very honored of having Professor Evan Thompson, with whom we will start the exploration of the segment of this genealogical path dedicated to Francisco Varela's view of autonomous systems and more in general of autonomy. So Professor Evan Thompson is a writer, is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. His research is focusing on the nature of mind, the nature of the self, the nature of human experience. And on this topic he published extensively based on a profound and profoundly transdisciplinary research. Among his publications, we find masterpieces such as The Embodied Mind, written with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche, Color Vision, Mind in Life, Walking, Dreaming, Being. So we are very thankful for your presence here, Evan. And without further ado, I will leave you the stage. So I stop sharing.
All right. So I'm going to just take a minute to share my screen. So let me just do that. So I have to get this into presenter mode, which is difficult to do with the new Zoom configuration. Sorry about this, everybody. Just trying to get PowerPoint into view so that I can do this. All right, I'm going to have to, there we go. Okay. All right, does that look good? All good? Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to give this presentation to all of you, and thanks everybody for attending. I understand my task to be to talk about Francisco's ideas about autonomy and autonomous systems. And in particular, to do that, now I'm having trouble with PowerPoint. Sorry about this. Hold on, give me a second here. Particularly to do that in relationship to his book, Principles of Biological Autonomy, which was published in 1979. This is a photo of Francisco from a few years before that. I think it was 1978 or 77 maybe, when he was talking at the Lindisfarne Association. And I should say that this book is going to be, it's out of print and has been out of print for quite some time, so it's very difficult to get a hold of, but it's going to be reissued by MIT Press in an edition that is going to be annotated by Ezekiel Di Paolo and me, and that will probably emerge sometime maybe 2024 or 2025. We're just really in the early stages of working on that, but it's just to say it should become much more widely available very soon. All right, so what I'm going to be doing is really focusing initially on the discussion of autonomy in Principles of Biological Autonomy in the first part, where Francisco talks about autonomy of the living and organizational closure. So the book is divided into three parts. The first part on autonomy, organizational closure, autopoiesis. Then he has a second part, which is all of his formal mathematical logical work where he's modeling autopoiesis and autonomous systems. So I'm not going to talk about that. I've talked a little bit about that in some other lectures. The Not One, Not Two presentation for the Ouroboros I did a couple of years ago covers some of that material. And then I'm going to also say a few things about the third part of the book, where Francisco applies these ideas to cognitive processes, particularly to the nervous system. He talks about both the immune system, or the immune network, and the nervous system, and I'll say some things about the nervous system along the way. Okay, so I know there's been a number of presentations already on autopoiesis, and I haven't had a chance to view all of the presentations, so there might be some repetition in terms of some of the things I say and some of the things that other people have said. But I think this is actually important in terms of setting up the context for the concept of autonomy that Francisco is working with, and then the concept of autonomous systems as he precisely defines it. So the background here that I'm going to initially introduce is Umberto Maturana's introduction to the volume in English called Autopoiesis and Cognition, which has the text on autopoiesis that Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela wrote together, and then also has an earlier text by Umberto Maturana at the beginning of the book on the biology of cognition, which is a very important antecedent text to work on autopoiesis. And this is a text in which Maturana links the problem of the living organization with the problem of cognition, and makes his very famous statement that living is a process of cognition. So in the introduction, prior to that text, Maturana has this very interesting personal statement of how the word autopoiesis came to be used according to his recollection and his account. So he says the second essay included in this book was written in 1972 as an expansion of the section on living systems in the biology of cognition. The writing of this essay was in fact triggered by a conversation that Francisco Varela and I had, in which he said, if indeed the circular organization is sufficient to characterize living systems as unities, then one should be able to put it in more formal terms. I agreed, but said that a formalization could only come after a complete linguistic description, and we immediately began to work on the complete description. So just in terms of principles of biological autonomy, the linguistic description is the first part of the book, where Francisco talks about autopoiesis and autonomy. The formal description, Francisco's work in logic and mathematics, is the second part of principles of biological autonomy. And this book collects together a number of Francisco's papers and synthesizes them into this more synthetic presentation. So Maturana goes on, he says, yet we were unhappy with the expression circular organization, and we wanted a word that would by itself convey the central feature of the organization of the living, which is autonomy. It was in these circumstances that one day, while talking with a friend, Jose Bulnes, about an essay of his on Don Quixote de la Mancha, in which he analyzed Don Quixote's dilemma of whether to follow the path of arms, praxis, action, or the path of letters, poiesis, creation, production, and his eventual choice of the path of praxis, deferring any attempt at poiesis, I understood for the first time the power of the word poiesis and invented the word that we needed, autopoiesis. This was a word without a history, a word that could directly mean what takes place in the dynamics of the autonomy proper to living systems. Curiously, but not surprisingly, the invention of this word proved of great value. It simplified enormously the task of talking about the organization of the living without falling into the always gaping trap of not saying anything new because the language does not permit it. We could not escape being immersed in a tradition, but with an adequate language, we could orient ourselves differently and perhaps from the new perspective, generate a new tradition. So this is a very interesting passage because on the one hand, it picks up, you might say, very ancient concepts like autonomy, which of course, goes back to the Greeks, autos, nomos, self-governing or giving oneself one's own norms, and then relates it to a new coinage, the idea of autopoiesis, self-production, which is a word that's said to be without a history. In fact, though I don't think Maturana and Varela knew this, Georges Canguilhem had in fact used the word autopoiesis in one of his texts in the 1960s, but he doesn't really make anything of the word. He uses it kind of in passing and then doesn't develop it. So it's a word in effect without antecedent usage, but it's being placed in a long tradition of thought concerned with life under the understanding of the concept of autonomy. So that's why I've highlighted these things in green, and also given on the right the sort of logical progression of thought here, which is you could say an immediate experience or perception of living systems as unities on the part of the biologist or someone who's studying life, the sense in advance of recognizing life as such, which needs to be in place in order to motivate and orient biological research. And then a precision of that notion in terms of the notion of organization. This is an idea that in the context of biology goes back to Kant in his third critique, the Critique of Judgment, where Kant actually introduces for the first time the word self-organization and says living beings are self-organizing. And Kant talks about this in terms of a kind of circularity of whole and part. So we have a specification of living systems as unities in terms of their being organized in a certain way such that they are unities, which is said to be circular. That gets made precise in the text on autopoiesis and in Francisco's work on autonomy in terms of this idea of organizational closure, which I'll say more about. And that is said to be the central feature of the living, autonomy, or to capture or make more precise the central feature of the living, which is autonomy, which then is conceptually, you might say, operationalized or theorized in terms of this new concept of autopoiesis. So we need to say something about autopoiesis in order then to recover the idea of autonomy that's in play here. So now I'm going to say just some things that will recapitulate things I imagine have been talked about before here in terms of the book Autopoiesis and Cognition, with this specifically with the text on autopoiesis that Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela wrote together. Okay, so autopoiesis at the outset is said to be a property of the organization of living systems. And it's actually postulated in this text as the defining property in the sense of being necessary and sufficient to characterize the living organization. Organization is said to be a characteristic of machines. They use the word machine, and this is something I'm going to come back to later at the end of the talk. Said to be a characteristic of machines. Today, we would probably use the word system. And they say that a machine is a unity made of components characterized by certain properties, capable of satisfying certain relations that determine the interactions and transformations of those components. And those relations are what constitute the machine's organization. So organization is a relational notion. It's an abstract relational notion. And the connection to machine or to mechanism, they say, is that it implies a non-animistic, that's actually their term, a non-animistic outlook. So this would be contrary, for example, to vitalism in the history of biology. It means a specification of a unity in terms of its organization, its abstract relational configuration, and it signifies, they say, a viewpoint oriented towards dynamism. That's also their word. The contrast that's crucial here is between organization and structure, and this comes out of cybernetics, but they really use this distinction in a rigorous way that often isn't followed by other people, even today, writing in this literature. So organization, as I've already said, is the abstract set of relations that define a system as belonging to a given class, whereas structure is the system's actual realization, the concrete components that constitute it, and the actual and concrete relations between them. So to illustrate that, we can make the point that concrete living systems, organisms, can be instantiated in a wide variety of structures, and a given structure can belong to more than one class of organization. So Fido is a dog, Fido is a mammal, Fido is a living organism. These can be, as class notions, these need to be specified in terms of the different organizations that they exemplify. Structures also change over time, even if the organization remains invariant. So Bessie the cow was a calf, is a heifer, will be an old milk cow. The organization as cow remains invariant, but the structural realization of that changes throughout the life cycle. Now, given that distinction, they define an autopoietic system organizationally as a machine that is organized, which means defined as a unity, as a network of processes of production, transformation, and destruction of components. And then these are the two conditions, which following Ezekiel Di Paolo, I will call self-production and self-distinction, though of course the whole thing is self-production in the sense of the concept of autopoiesis as a whole. So first, the components through their interactions and transformations continuously regenerate and realize the network of processes and relations that produce them, and they constitute the system or the machine as a concrete unity in the space in which the processes exist, by specifying the topological domain of its realization as a network. So the idea that in the case of autopoiesis, the unity is defined in terms of a topological boundary is especially significant and important in contrast, as we'll see, to the more general definition of autonomy, where the processes need to exist in some domain, but they don't necessarily have to be realized in terms of a topologically bounded system in the way that a cell is with its membrane. So we can illustrate that idea then in terms of the structure now concretely of a system that consists of an internal metabolic reaction network that produces or synthesizes its own molecular components that constitute a topological boundary that in turn creates the conditions for the generation of the metabolic reaction network. So this is the circular organization understood in the physical space of, say, the biochemical structures of molecular processes. Then in the case of life on Earth, all life on Earth as we know it, we know that this also has this complexification of the very stable and precise relationship between amino acids and nucleic acids that allow for all sorts of processes and allow for certain kinds of generational stability through reproduction. But reproduction is made very clear in the text on autopoiesis, and cognition is secondary, logically, conceptually, to self-production, because you need reproducers in order for there to be reproduction, and the reproducer is the self-producing or self-constituting individual. So when you define a system that way organizationally and structurally, in terms of, say, an internal reaction network and a topological boundary that are looped in these the self-producing way, that immediately gives you a recipe or a set of criteria for distinguishing systems that meet those criteria from systems that don't. So a bacterium, an amoeba, they structurally realize these three criteria of a boundary, a network, and an interdependence between them, and therefore they are physical realizations of the autopoietic organization. Whereas an autocatalytic set, for instance, which is sometimes loosely described as autopoietic, strictly speaking, does not meet the criteria of autopoiesis, because the boundary is given by, say, the container in the lab, and in the case of autocatalysis in a living cell, you have the larger autopoietic context in which the autocatalysis is happening. But in the mere autocatalytic set, you don't have that. So it doesn't then count as autopoietic according to these criteria. So the point here is that you have, in effect, a kind of recipe, or you might say decision procedure, for deciding, the extent to which something realizes, physically, structurally realizes the autopoietic organization. Okay, so that's all just review of the concept of autopoiesis in the text by Umberto and Francisco. Then they go on to specify or unpack what they call consequences of the autopoietic organization. And the first one that they mention is that autopoietic systems are autonomous. So here the concept of autonomy enters again into the discussion. And what they mean by that in this discussion is that autopoietic systems subordinate all changes to the maintenance of their own organization. So any perturbation or stimulation or developmental change that a physical autopoietic system undergoes has to happen in the context of the ongoing maintenance of organization, and in that sense has to be subordinated to it. Otherwise, if it compromises autopoiesis, if autopoiesis ceases, then the system ceases to be living in the sense of being autopoietic. So that's what they mean in the context of this text by autonomy. And then they go on to talk about a number of other consequences. Autopoietic systems have individuality. That is, you could say they self-individuate. They maintain their own identity independent of outside stipulative conventions of the observer. They're unities in the sense that they specify their own boundaries as part of their self-production. And then, very famously, they say that autopoietic systems don't have inputs and outputs. And what they mean by this is that they can be perturbed by events and compensate for them. But again, whatever compensations happen are under the imperative, as it were, of the continuance of the autopoietic organization. And then any relation between those changes and the outside perturbations that we note in terms of a kind of structural congruence between the inside of the system and the outside of the system in the environment, that pertains to the domain of the observer, the domain in which the observer beholds the system, but it is not constitutive of the autopoietic organization as such. And this distinction between systems that don't have inputs and outputs and systems that do is, in terms of the language of principles of biological autonomy, a distinction between systems that are autonomous and systems that can be understood in terms of external control, where one, for example, treats the environment as if it were acting as a controller on the system in terms of features that the system needs to relate itself to. But that whole discussion is then from the perspective of the observer and is in effect bracketing out the proper autopoiesis or autonomy of the system. So this is something we'll come back to. Okay, so that's all background. Now, the reason I've gone through all of this is because what Francisco does in Principles of Biological Autonomy is he reframes these concepts so that autonomy becomes the generic concept and autopoiesis the paradigm for understanding it. And this is, you might say, well, this is implicit in Maturana's statement that I quoted at the outset. It's implicit in the text of Autopoiesis and Cognition. Yes, in a sense, that's true. But the making of it explicit and the sort of complete turning around of the conceptual frame to make autonomy be the central concept and autopoiesis the paradigm for understanding it, that's really what Principles of Biological Autonomy does. And that, as a result, has a whole number of conceptual, logical, empirical consequences. So this is how Francisco puts it on page 57. He says, the role that living systems play in the characterization of organizational closure is one of paradigmatic case. Autopoiesis is a case of and not synonymous with organizational closure, and the autonomy of living systems is a case of and not synonymous with autonomy in general. However, because of the kind of detail we have in our knowledge of living systems, and because there are some particularly minimal cases, such as the cell, the basis of autonomy is clearer in living systems, whence their exemplary character. There is a mass of experience and tradition in biology that suggests and confirms the autopoietic nature of the living organization. So the key takeaway here is that autonomy becomes the overarching framing concept. Autopoiesis becomes a paradigm for it. Autopoiesis, strictly speaking, pertains to the single cell, which is what Francisco means here by a minimal case. A few pages earlier, he says, we can take the lessons offered by the autonomy of living systems, in particular, of course, he means autopoiesis, and convert them into an operational characterization of autonomy in general, living and otherwise. So, of course, with this sort of change in logical frame, conceptual frame, or it reframing with the same concept, but shifting the way the frame is working, we now, of course, have the explicit possibility that there could be systems that are autonomous, but that are not living. And that means, presumably in terms of the context of the theory of autopoiesis, not autopoietic or not based on autopoiesis. And this continues to be an open issue of discussion in the literature on the relationship between autopoiesis and autonomy. So that's something to signal here. Okay, so we can convert the lessons, he says, into an operational characterization of autonomy. So that's what we then get in Principles of Biological Autonomy. We get this definition of an autonomous system. But Francisco says autonomous systems are mechanistic. So here we see again the commitment to the idea of mechanistic explanation, which in terms of autopoiesis and cognition is explicitly stated in terms of a machine model. Autopoietic systems are machines, or living systems, as they put it, are autopoietic machines. So machine is a key conceptual metaphor here. And I'm going to come back to this at the very end of the discussion. So autonomous systems are mechanistic, dynamic systems defined as a unity by their organization. We shall say that autonomous systems are organizationally closed. That is, their organization is characterized by processes such that, and then we get two conditions that are parallel to the two conditions for autopoiesis. The processes are related as a network so that they recursively depend on each other in the generation and realization of the processes themselves. And two, they constitute the system as a unity recognizable in the space, parentheses, domain in which the processes exist. So in the definition of autopoiesis, that second part refers to topological unity. Now we don't have topological unity, we have space, but domain indicates that space is being understood here, not necessarily physically or geometrically, but abstractly as a domain in which the processes exist. So we have then the analogous conditions of self-generation and self-distinction that we saw before in the case of autopoiesis, but now generalized for the case of autonomy in general. So an autonomous system is organized. So organization is this abstract class idea. So we're defining autonomous systems as a class in terms of set of relations that must hold among the processes that make them up. So there are networks of processes organized so that the processes recursively depend on each other to generate and realize themselves and their configuration as a network. And they constitute the system as a unity in the domain in which the processes exist. So the processes, in the case of autopoiesis, exist in the domain of molecular production, so biochemical processes. But here, the domain is general. And so it's an open question. Well, what sorts of domains can, or what sorts of processes and what sorts of domains can realize this kind of circular organization? Okay, so that's all autonomy or autonomous system in very abstract conceptual terms. And then there's the question of, well, what systems fulfill these criteria? Well, we know that cells do, cellular, unicellular organisms. That's the paradigm case of autopoiesis. We know that in terms of the logic of principles of biological autonomy, that Francisco treats the nervous system and the immune system as, let's say, being able to be productively modeled in this framework of autonomy. And of course, the case of the nervous system goes back to Maturana's work, where he links the circular organization of the living and the circular organization of the nervous system in that early text, The Biology of Cognition. And then we have, other types of systems, multicellular organisms. Do they meet the criteria of autonomy? This turns out, intuitively, of course, yes, but this turns out to actually be tricky because what exactly are the processes, in what domain do they exist? Are they actually another case of autopoiesis, or is it a case of autonomy without autopoiesis? Umberto and Francisco raised this question in the Tree of Knowledge, and they say that we don't have enough knowledge actually to answer this question. So they talk about metacellulars and have a more general discussion of metacellulars. Within the under the heading of metacellulars, then we have all sorts of other cases, biological colonies, bacterial colonies, for example, or social groups. The ecosphere as a whole, the whole Earth system, in the sense of originally the Gaia theory, or what now today is called Earth system science. So here, the question marks indicate the idea that you could very much productively approach these biological phenomena through the framework of autonomy, but you would have to do an awful lot of work empirically and conceptually to specify the processes that are realized as an autonomous network in a way where we have a much better grip on how to do that in the case of, say, autopoiesis and the single cell. Okay, so in this same chapter where Francisco defines an autonomous system operationally in this way, he asserts what he calls the closure thesis. He says every autonomous system is organizationally closed. So we have a linkage between organizational closure and autonomy. We've already seen organizational closure paradigmatically in the case of autopoiesis. So if we want to illustrate organizational closure more abstractly, what's meant by this, or I should also say, and we could have a whole discussion about this, there's a shifting terminology where Francisco eventually comes to favor the term operational closure over organizational closure. And he never gives a precise definition of the difference between the two. So you have to sort of discern what the difference is in context. And we could talk about that, but I'm going to sort of, depending, as you'll see, I might slide back and forth a little bit between them. So here we have, I think, a very wonderful diagram from Ezequiel Di Paolo that illustrates the general idea of organizational or operational closure. So closure is being used, it should be said, in the mathematical or algebraic or logical sense to mean a domain in which an operation gives rise to a process or a result that stays within that same domain of operation. So, you add numbers together, you get more numbers that can be added together. There's closure in arithmetic under the operation of addition. So it's that notion of closure. It's not physical closed offedness. It's a logical notion. So that's illustrated here in terms of the black circles. So the circles represent processes or events. Every black circle conditions, enables, and that's illustrated by the arrow, another black circle. So for each black circle, it's conditioned or enabled by another, and it in turn conditions or enables another. There are other processes in this milieu of processes that influence this network that's interconnected in this way, but that don't exist within that organization of closure. So you can think of these as, enzymatic processes in a cell. You might think of them as interactions among insects in a colony, or interactions among bacteria, or interactions constitutive of a slime mold. It's like an open question what you could apply this to. But the abstract idea is of processes that are interdependent in such a way that they constitute a unity because each one affects at least one other one and is affected by one other one. So you have then the emergence of this kind of dense network against a background of other processes. And in a real, physical thermodynamic universe, these processes are precarious in the sense that they're always subject to running down or to atrophying, and independent of the network in which they are sort of sucked into, they will tend to run down. So the network is self-enabling as a network, and it's also enabling of the constituent processes, such that if the network weren't there, those processes would most likely cease to exist. So that's the basic idea of organizational closure illustrated. And then the question is, okay, so what can that be productively applied to? Now, what Francisco says is that every autonomous system is organizationally closed. So every autonomous system has that organization that we just illustrated. That's the closure thesis. So logically, that means if a system is autonomous, then it's organizationally closed, which is to say that organizational closure is necessary for a system to be autonomous. A system can't be autonomous unless it's organizationally closed. But Francisco actually goes on to say something stronger than that. He says the vague notion of autonomy is made equivalent to that of organizational closure. Now, equivalence implies that organizational closure is not just necessary, but it's also sufficient for a system to be autonomous. So in this text, we already have an ambiguity between a necessity claim and a sufficiency claim. The problem here is that if organizational closure is sufficient, then in relationship to, let's say, the full-blown idea of an autonomous system as a sense-making system, that's going to mean that organizational closure is sufficient, not just for identity in the sense of the self-individuation of the system, but also for its being a sense-making system. That is a system that, through its coupling with the environment, as we say later, enacts or brings forth significance or a domain of relevance or value or meaning. So in this ambiguity about necessity and sufficiency, we also have hidden an issue about the relationship between organizational closure, identity, and sense-making. In a later article that came out of a paper that Francisco gave at a conference in San Marino, organized by Alvaro Moreno, where I was also present, Francisco illustrated this idea of now operational closure is the term, being the generative principle for the emergence of an identity. So in the case of autopoiesis, that's the single cell, but Francisco also lists sensory motor loops. So this is in the case of the multicellular organism with the nervous system, or immune networks for the multicellular organism that has the self, non-self, or self non-sense somatic recognition constitution. So we have these different kinds of closure: autopoiesis, sensory motor loops, immune networks, all talked about in principles of biological autonomy. Operational closure being the generic principle for the emergence of an identity, which Francisco says entails a domain of interactions. When you have a system that has an identity, it immediately specifies its cognitive domain, to use the term that Maturana and Varela used in autopoiesis and cognition. And a domain of interactions is the, it's not quite right, I would say, to say it causes the emergence of. I would say it's the, it's a constitutive requirement for, or ingredient of significance or information. You could say, you know, meaning in a very general sense. And Francisco illustrates this in terms of, you know, cell signaling, perception, action, somatic recognition. So in this diagram, with the domain of interactions and significance information as part of the story, we have what Francisco elsewhere calls sense-making. This is all the sense-making side of autonomy. And it's linked here constitutively to closure and identity. Now, the issue is that it seems clear on the basis of subsequent work that's been done that the sufficiency claim that organizational closure is sufficient for autonomy if autonomy is understood to include sense-making, which it properly should, that's too strong because organizational closure is necessary, but not sufficient for sense-making. So we can put it this way. If we go back to the definition of an autonomous system, we have this idea that it's a network of processes that individuates itself through self-generation, self-distinction, the recursive generation and realization of the processes as a network that constitute the system as a unity in the domain in which the processes exist. But that's not enough for autonomy, I would say, in the sense in which that concept really figures over the history of philosophical and biological thought, which is the root concept in a way, going back to Maturana's invocation of it, because an autonomous system also needs to be a sense-making system. Autonomy means giving yourself your own laws, your own norms. So sense-making is an inherent part of what it is to be autonomous. So we need then the processes that are realized as a network to constitute the unity as a sense-making unity, as a sense-making agent in its domain of interactions. Organizational closure doesn't seem to be enough for that. Organizational or operational closure generates an identity, which entails a domain of interactions, but it doesn't suffice to make the domain of interactions be a domain of sense making. Now, I should say by way of an aside here, this also arises in the discussion of autopoiesis, about whether autopoiesis is necessary and sufficient for the living organization, or whether it's just necessary, because it depends how you understand autopoiesis. If you understand it as you could have an autopoietic system that just consisted in a network that did nothing other than produce a boundary, as in, say, Luigi Luisi's work on autocatalytic micelles, or in some of the dynamical systems cellular automata models of autopoiesis. So it doesn't have an internal chemical reaction network. It just has a reaction network that generates its own boundedness and repairs that boundedness. So it's, you might say, well, that's sort of minimally autopoietic. A system like that can't really interact adaptively with its environment. It either holds itself together under a certain range of perturbations, or it goes into a kind of catastrophe and ceases to be autopoietic. So this expresses the kind of all or nothing characteristic of autopoiesis. A system is either autopoietic or it isn't, but it doesn't capture, which we see in the simplest living cells, the high degree of plasticity and adaptivity that living cells have to regulate themselves in relationship to the environment. So then the question arises, well, should autopoiesis really properly be understood as a network that has that adaptive characteristic, though it's not explicitly mentioned in the original definition, or is there some more minimal or proto sense of autopoiesis in which it's not included? So that's the analog here of this more general issue about autonomy, where the question is, yes, organizational closure suffices, is necessary and sufficient for, you might say, a kind of minimal identity, a unity in some domain of interaction, some space of processes. But that doesn't entail in and of itself that unity regulates itself in relationship to its milieu, such that it's a sense-making system, which is really what we need for autonomy in the proper sense of the word. So sense-making now requires that the system, that the processes making up the system be precarious. That is, they exist in precarious conditions. They're in danger of running down. So this is, of course, the case in the real physical world under the laws of thermodynamics, and that the system be able to regulate itself in relationship to precarious conditions, to alter itself appropriately depending on conditions. That is, to have a capacity for adaptivity. Now, the term adaptivity here enters into the discussion through work by Ezequiel Di Paolo in this paper he wrote in Phenomenology and Cognitive Sciences on Jonas, teleology, and autopoiesis. And he introduces this idea of adaptivity by saying that an autonomous system, adaptivity is an autonomous system's capacity to regulate its states in relation to the environment, such that tendencies to approach the system's viability boundary, that's not a physical boundary, that's like a conceptual boundary, that is, the viability boundary, when you go beyond that, then the system starts to lose autonomy. There needs to be within the system a way of regulating states such that tendencies to approach the viability boundary are distinguished from tendencies to move away from the boundary, and tendencies to approach the boundary are transformed or can be transformed into tendencies to move away from the boundary. So bacteria, the simplest bacteria, chemotaxic bacteria, so-called simplest, in the sense of their size and structure, already do this in extremely complicated ways when they swim up gradient, metabolizing sugar, which is one of Francisco's examples, core examples of sense making. They swim up a gradient, or they swim down a gradient away from heavy metals or noxious stimuli. So they're regulating, they're changing gene expression as they do this. They're doing very kind of complicated processes that all have to do with what Ezequiel here is calling adaptivity, the regulation of the system in relationship to its viability boundary, beyond which if it goes beyond which it will be unable to continue to exist. Okay, so if we think of this in terms of our picture of organizational closure, if that network of processes that exhibits closure consists of processes that, among the black circles, that instantiate in some way a capacity for regulation. This does not have to be an explicit sort of monitoring or tracking of regulation in ways that we might see, say, in the nervous system. It could be inbuilt structurally or organizationally, say in the form of changes to gene expression in bacteria. But if those processes have that capacity for adaptivity, then they regulate themselves in relationship to the environment. So we have what we need for sense making. But if we take that regulative or adaptivity capacity away and we just have closure, then we don't have enough for sense making. So closure then is necessary, but not sufficient for sense making. Okay, so going back then to the autonomy side of the story, we can say that sense-making is the relational and interactional side of autonomy, understood in the way that makes adaptivity explicit. That is, in generating and sustaining and regulating its identity in precarious conditions, an adaptive autonomous system makes sense out of its encounters. That is, it constitutes a perspective from which encounters acquire significance. And this is in the picture I showed you earlier, Francisco's diagram. This is explicit in the diagram in terms of things like cell signaling and sensory motor loops and somatic recognition. All of that has to do with sense making, with the creation or generation or enacting, as we say later, of significance on the part of the system, autonomous system, in its relationship to the environment, such that the environment thereby becomes a place of significance and valence, or we could say in general terms, that there is a relevance, a realization in the sense of an instantiation and, if you will, understanding of relevance on the part of the autonomous system. Okay. I want to bring more explicitly now the nervous system into the discussion. And the nervous system enters the discussion here, where we're dealing with the case of multicellular organisms, metazoa, that need to hold together as unities as they move rapidly over great distances, where mere chemical diffusion of signals is too slow. So you need these specialized cells that have long projections, neurons with axons and dendrites, and that can signal in a fast electrochemical way so that the sensory and motor surfaces of the organism are very tightly coupled and very tightly linked. Now, this, of course, as an example, is in the original text of Autopoiesis, the Organization of the Living. It's an appendix on the nervous system as an organizationally closed system, that is, as an autonomous system. And it is retaken and revised in certain respects by Francisco in Principles of Biological Autonomy in part 3 as one of the case studies, if you will, of cognitive processes seen through the autonomy perspective. The other example being the immune network. Okay, so when we're thinking of the nervous system as an autonomous system, of course, we are already dealing with a system that's constituted in terms of its anatomical structure through neurons by autopoietic systems. That neurons are cells, neurons are themselves autopoietic systems, but they are interconnected in this very dense way among themselves, and of course crucially supported by other kinds of cells like glial cells. And the way that organizational or operational closure is usually the term Francisco prefers when talking about the nervous system, the way that concept applies to the nervous system is that neuronal activity is always generated by other neuronal activity and always generates still further neuronal activity. So it's the activity functions under closure in this, if you will, algebraic sense. And of course, the nervous system is adaptively self-regulating in precarious conditions. It adaptively self-regulates in relationship to the internal milieu of the body, and it adaptively self-regulates in relationship to the body in the environment. So we have a similar circular organization then as in autopoiesis. This is a kind of simplification. where if we think of the nervous system as consisting of a number of neural networks or of a centralized neural network like the brain, we have different assemblies or ensembles that make up the nervous system. They generate their own so-called, intrinsic or endogenous activity. This is, of course, a huge theme of Francisco's work at the, very well, all through his life, but especially at the end of his life, with his work on phase synchrony as a principle of large-scale integration for neuronal ensembles. So neuronal ensembles underlie the shifting patterns of the nervous system. They link sensory and motor surfaces. The sensory motor interactions constantly modulate the dynamics of the nervous system. So you have a kind of, again, circular organization, autonomous loop, where there is a constant coupling of exogenously arising modulation and internally arising self-generated activity. So we have then a kind of analogy. It's just an analogy of circularity here. There's no obviously precise one-to-one mapping here. This illustrates the sort of general idea of circularity. Francisco would often talk about this as, in the case of autopoiesis, the biologic, the basic biologic of life. That's the sort of minimal case. And then the particular elaboration of it in the course of natural history and evolution of animals with the neurologic, where what's crucial here, again, is not just the operational closure in the strict sense of the nervous system, but the fact that the nervous system regulates adaptively its own activity. And that is what underlies, if you will, the phenomena of cognition and emotion as we know them in the sort of more familiar animal cases. Okay, so I want to now connect these things to the idea of enaction, since this is core enaction. I feel that some connection of the ideas about autonomy to enaction is required, and their significance and importance for enaction. In the embodied mind, where we first really put forward the idea of the enactive approach in cognitive science, we do so in a way where the concepts of autonomy and of autonomous systems figure explicitly in the formulation of enaction. So I just want to call to people's attention the places in the book where this happens, so that you can go back and look at it if you want in this light. So in the chapter that's called the Cartesian Anxiety, which is the chapter that leads up to chapter 8, where we first present the enactive approach, we make an observation. This is actually in the context of talking about Marvin Minsky's book, Society of Mind. We make an observation about cognitive science at the time. So this is we're writing this in the late 1980s, of course, this is a long time ago. We say, in fact, an important and pervasive shift is beginning to take place in cognitive science under the very influence of its own research. This shift requires that we move away from the idea of the world as independent and extrinsic to the idea of a world as inseparable from the structure of these processes of self-modification. This change in stance does not express a mere philosophical preference. It reflects the necessity of understanding cognitive systems not on the basis of their input and output relationships, but by their operational closure. So this goes all the way back to autopoiesis and cognition, where it said that organizationally closed, autopoietic, autonomous systems do not have inputs and outputs. That is to say, when you model a system in its proper autonomy or autopoiesis, you can no longer treat it according to input-output engineering control type models. A system that has operational closure is one in which the results of its processes are those processes themselves. The notion of operational closure is thus a way of specifying classes of processes that in their very operation turn back upon themselves to form autonomous networks. Such networks do not fall into the class of systems defined by external mechanisms of control, that's heteronomy, but rather into the class of systems defined by internal mechanisms of self-organization, autonomy. The key point is that such systems do not operate by representation. Instead of representing an independent world, they enact a world as a domain of distinctions that is inseparable from the structure embodied by the cognitive system. So this is how we introduce the concept of enaction before we actually define it explicitly. And it's in contrast, so it aligns with autonomy. So autonomy is contrasted with heteronomy or with external control. autonomy is aligned with enaction, sense making, and contrasted to representation and input-output. Now, if we were having this discussion today, we could retake all of these concepts which have evolved in all sorts of ways. So there's a huge discussion about, is enaction compatible with representation understood in certain other ways? I'm not going to get into all that now. When we are specifically contrasting enaction and representation here, we have in mind a particular understanding of the conception of representation, which is this idea of a kind of internal mapping of an independent external outside world, traditionally expressed in terms of a symbolic mapping, but not necessarily symbolic. It could also take the form of patterns in neural networks of the sort we see in deep learning today. So again, we can have a discussion of what representation means, but that's the context in which we were writing there. So that's where this enaction autonomy link first happens. Then we start chapter 8 with a model, very simple model that Francisco devised of a cellular automaton that, because of its organizational closure and the milieu in which it is placed, enacts a distinction between odd and even sequences. So we use this as a kind of illustration. There's been some subsequent work on the nature of this model and its limitations. And then jumping to chapter 9, when we explicitly define enaction, we say that from the enactive perspective, cognition is enaction. It's a history of structural coupling that brings forth a world. How does it work? Through a network consisting of multiple levels of interconnected sensory motor subnetworks. Now, it's not explicit here, but really network here means autonomous network. And the interconnected sensory motor subnetworks are themselves autonomous subnetworks in the sense of the nervous system as an autonomous system. So it's not just any old network. It's got to be an autonomous network, which today we would say means organizational or operational closure and adaptivity. And then how do I know when a cognitive system is functioning adequately, when it becomes part of an existing world, as the young of every species do, or shapes a new one, as happens in evolutionary history? So we can illustrate this specifically in relationship to the sensory motor case, which we really use as one of our main illustrative cases in the embodied mind, where you have on the one side this circular organization, the autonomous organization and adaptivity of the nervous system and the brain that makes possible sensory motor coupling and is constantly modulated by it in a milieu or an environment that consists of various contours, structures, things that afford that sensory motor coupling and that limit it. And through this dynamic of structural coupling of the autonomous system and the environment, you have what in biology today is often called niche construction. You have the bringing forth of an environment of meaning and relevance. So enaction then is an inherently relational notion that has to do with the coupling or the relationality of the autonomous system in its adaptivity, in its being embedded and immersed in a milieu. And then we have, through subsequent work, the elaboration and development of this in an ongoing way with all sorts of open questions. So I'm just, as I'm coming into the end now, I'm just going to highlight some of these things. We get a kind of suite of enactive concepts where the foundational ones are the ones I've just been talking about, autonomy and sense making as the core of enaction. And then we have subsequent elaborations in the form of refinements of the notion of organizational closure and autonomy. So, for example, we have work by Alvaro Moreno and Mocio Macio on the idea of constraint closure in their book Biological Autonomy. So that was published in 2014, I think. So we have a kind of more elaborated and detailed model of what closure can mean. Then we have these ideas of agency and participatory sense making that Ezequiel Di Paolo and Hannah Dieger have developed. some of my ideas about sensory motor subjectivity. We have DiPaolo and Dieger's work on linguistic bodies. So all of that is in these books on sensory motor life and biological autonomy and linguistic bodies and mind and life. These works all sort of take these concepts and develop them and elaborate them in different ways. Okay, so to come to the end, I want to highlight some ongoing open questions in this field, if you will. And there are 4 of them that I'm going to go through. So one goes back to the initial embrace of the concept of a machine and machine models and mechanistic explanation, which runs throughout autopoiesis and cognition, and also runs throughout principles of biological autonomy. And that's related to the question of teleology. And then another question, which I did mention in passing earlier, has to do with the variety of autonomous systems, the different levels and kinds of autonomous systems. And then lastly, I want to say something about human sociality and how this figures in the discussion of autonomy and autonomous systems. Okay, so machine models and mechanistic explanation. So the question here is, are autonomous systems, that is operationally or organizationally closed adaptive systems, are they machines? And more generally, are they subject to mechanistic explanation? As I've said, Maturana and Varela define organization, autopoiesis, and autonomy in terms of the concept of a machine, and in terms, they treat it in terms of mechanistic explanation. This contrasts with other thinkers working, or some other thinkers, specifically Robert Rosen, working with very similar concepts at the same time. So Rosen has a discussion of living systems as closed under efficient causation. And he has a class of models called metabolism repair systems. He uses category theory to develop these models. And the basic idea is it's really another way of talking about what Varela would call organizational operational closure. But Rosen is very explicit in saying that these are different from machines, both concretely in the sense of any machine we have ever been able to build, which of course Maturana and Varela would agree with, but also he thinks that they really are not subject to mechanistic explanation, at least in terms of what mechanistic explanation has traditionally and historically been understood, precisely because they have certain kinds of recursive self-referentialities that mechanistic explanation can't handle, because it fractures systems into components that need to be defined in terms of their independent functionality that then get aggregated in some way. And so systems that have a kind of inbuilt reflexivity and self-referentiality, you can't treat that way. And so for this reason, Rosen says, no, these are not machines. They're not subject to mechanistic explanation. And he even, though I'm not qualified to comment on this, has a mathematical treatment of these systems in which he argues, or I suppose he would claim, to prove rigorously that these systems are not Turing computable. Now, there's been a whole discussion of that in the literature, whether that proof works, and I'm not qualified to comment on that, but it's a very interesting conceptual contrast. Now, of course, in this discussion, we would need to say, well, what exactly do we mean by machine, and what exactly are the minimal criteria for mechanistic explanation? All of that is, part of a very live discussion that's happening today. But I just want to signal that where Maturana and Varela start is with a very, very strong commitment to mechanistic explanation, which I think in the case of Varela gets significantly altered through his work on phenomenology and his work on the next question, which has to do with teleology, which is, what is the status of teleological notions like goal, purposiveness, function? What's the status of those kinds of notions in relation to autonomous systems? Now, again, in autopoiesis and cognition and principles of biological autonomy, it's very clear that functions, goals, purposiveness are not constitutive of and are unnecessary for explaining the living organization, for explaining autopoiesis, and for biological autonomy. But Francisco later changes his mind on this And this happens through an appropriation of Hans Jonas's phenomenological biology and Jonas's discussion, building on Kant, of the organism as an intrinsically purposive entity, precisely because it's organizationally closed. So there becomes in Jonas's work a linkage of what Francisco would call organizational operational closure or autonomy and purposiveness, precisely the kind of linkage that classical cybernetics, that classical autopoietic theory said, no, that pertains only to the domain of the observer. Jonas is explicit in saying, no, it doesn't just pertain to the domain of the observer. It actually belongs to ontologically to the nature of the system itself. And Varela embraces this perspective in his paper with Andreas Weber and doesn't actually comment on the change in viewpoint, though I did talk to him about this and we could have a conversation about that. His response, I basically pointed this out to him and he said to me, yes, you're right, but I'd rather use the word sense-making than teleology. To which I said, fair, but of course, sense-making is a teleological notion. So, you know, that's kind of the way the discussion went. In contrast, Maturana, you know, up to my knowledge, you know, up to the end of his life and all of his writings, insisted that teleological notions belong only to the domain of the observer and are not properly operational notions to characterize the living organization. So that's a really big difference in the literature on autopoiesis as it evolves through, you know, Maturana's subsequent work and Francisco's subsequent work. And inactive researchers generally follow I can't pronounce that, the turn taken by Jonas. That is, you know, people use the word inaction today in different ways, but I'm thinking of, you know, myself and Ezekiel de Paulo and Hannah Dieger, people who are working under the influence of Jonas, you know, treat autonomy and autopoiesis as linked to purposiveness and intrinsic purposiveness. That is the system creating itself self-organizationally in a way that makes it oriented teleologically, purposively towards its environment. And that's one way in which the inactive approach departs from classical autopoiesis and from Varela's early work on autonomous systems. Third issue, I will just be very quick about this, is levels and kinds of autonomous systems. Actually, I really mentioned this earlier. Unicellular autopoiesis is the paradigm case. Varela, of course, goes on to develop autonomous system models of the brain and the immune system. And then there are questions about multicellular organisms, colonies, ecosystems, Gaia, the ecosphere, the Earth system. Can these be modeled productively with the tools of autonomous systems theory? And not just, I mean, I think the answer to that is in a way yes, but then the question is exactly how do we implement that, you know, in a precise way. Okay, last issue is human sociality. This I think is an important issue, and there's again, a whole discussion of this we could have, but I think it's very important to bring out here and mention that Francisco refused all along to apply the concept of autopoiesis to human social phenomena in the way that, say, theorists like Nicholas Newman do. He, for different kinds of reasons. One is because, you know, strictly speaking, autopoiesis requires this kind of topological boundary, and we don't have that in the case of human social systems. But there's a deeper and more fundamental reason here, which is that he, in general, expressed great reservations about analyzing human social phenomena in terms of systems theoretic concepts, including autonomous systems, that is, systems defined in terms of organizational operational closure. And in a paper that he published in the Family Process Journal, so this is a journal on family therapy, because there's a group of people in family therapy who found the concepts of autopoiesis useful for thinking about the family as an autonomous system, in effect. And Francisco, in this paper, introduces what he calls the system in, observer out, and observer in, system out principle. The idea here is that when you specify a system, so that's the system in, the observer recedes into the background. That's the observer out. And that works, not completely unproblematically, but, works generally fine for biological phenomena when you're, looking at a cell, or you're recording neuronal activity, or, you're measuring some change in the immune system. So you as an observer measurer are in the background. And of course, you can't forget the measurer epistemologically, but there's a way in which you can bracket it, as it were, in the effort to rigorously specify the system. But that doesn't work when the phenomena that you're studying are the human social phenomena in which you yourself participate, which of course includes science. So there is a recursivity that's going to happen here. So Francisco puts this by saying, once we bring the describer observer fully into the picture, then the very notion of a system founders. And he goes on and he says, the whole gamut of notions necessary for a stable description, for example, eigenbehaviors, stable patterns in natural systems, rules of generation, and natural drift. So all the concepts he's using in principles of biological autonomy. All of these notions are ipso facto in question. They all depend, for their significance, on relatively stable agreement as to what the system is. For example, organisms and immune network insect colonies, we do have stable agreement for the most part there, or we can achieve it, but there can hardly be stable agreements in the unstable shifting world of human actions. So the point here is that calling something a system, this is now my words, not Francisco's, calling something a system in the social domain, and we're always in the social domain, contributes to constituting it as a social reality. And such constitution is always shifting and contestable. This is maybe something, that would be productively talked about in terms of Ian Hacking's idea of looping effects, that when you call someone a citizen, or you call them gay or transgendered, or they call themselves that, or you call yourself a subject of a monarch, or you classify yourself in some diagnostic category. It's not just a description, it's also a constitution of yourself or someone else in terms of that categorical scheme, which is always in danger of a kind of reification, which is what Francisco is especially concerned about. So you have a kind of recursive, reflexive self-constitution that's happening here in a domain that's inherently subject to disagreements about norms and values. And you lose sight of all that if you think you can operationalize it by treating it, as it were, from the outside with the observer out through the application of a system concept like autonomy. So his recommendation then, and this is my last slide, his recommendation is then that social events and not social systems should be our concern in any examination of the human world. Such events are always situated in and brought forth by human actions within a human domain or space. They are never stable because they constantly generate responsive actions that differ from the events that elicited them. So the logic of an action here, when reflexively applied to ourselves, entails a kind of critical limitation on the applicability of the concept of autonomous systems to human social phenomena. And I think Francisco, and I think this is especially important to mention, Francisco is especially vigilant about this. And it's marked in this terminological conceptual distinction between events, and you might say, following Bruno Latour, networks, if you think of networks as linked events, events that condition each other, and you can try to follow patterns of them. So events, patterns, networks on the one hand, but not systems, even in the sense of autonomous systems in the case of human social phenomena. And so I think this is part of the inbuilt logic of let's say, core enaction, as I see it. So I will stop there.
So thank you very much for this wonderful, incredibly rich talk. I think that following our typical structure, maybe we can have now a 10 minutes break, and then we can start with the Q&A session. Thank you very, very much. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you soon.
Welcome back. So we can start with the Q&A session. Any questions? Chris, I see Chris for the moment. Please.
Hey there, Evan. First of all, thank you. I've been waiting a long time to get a chance to talk to you, so this is quite a treat for me. Probably read your books a whole bunch of times. So the first thing, I have a question specifically actually about the not one, not two paper that you did not touch upon. And it really relates to when we're talking about causation within autonomous systems. And it kind of goes along with the discussion of causality as bottom up and top down. I know you go at lengths at the end of Mind and Life talking about, you know, dynamic coevolution and Donald Campbell's idea of downward causation. And I was reading through Not One, Not Two, and it appears to me that Francisco actually makes a suggestion in 3.2 area of the paper. And so I'll kind of pose it as a true or false type of statement. And it seems to me that he's trying to suggest in that paper that you can't really talk about causation with that in mind without understanding the star relation. That does that make sense to you?
I would have to go back and look specifically at what he's saying there and the context. But I would say yes. I mean, that does make sense. I mean, the concept of causation is such a multifaceted, tricky, slippery concept that that's why I'd have to see the context of what specifically he's referring to there. But in general, in the case of a system that has this kind of closure, one way to describe what happens when you have that kind of closure is that you have the emergence of a distinct and new kind of causal regime, because the way that the processes unfold has to do with, you know, their immediate local influences on each other, but also has to do with the way that they are caught up in this larger configuration that that limits the space of possible behaviors and trajectories. And if I remember in Not One, Not Two, I mean, he has this distinction at the very beginning of the paper between, you know, writing a function that, you know, you conceptualize in terms of a limit, and then writing something out in terms of a network, a branching network or tree structure, and you need to do both. So if you take a system, an autonomous system, and you can, as it were, I think he even uses this term in that paper, you can cut it and then sort of lay it out in a descending tree structure, and that's a way of following the constituent processes locally. But when you do that, you lose the circular recursivity that you then, you know, capture in another way in terms of the expression via a function, but then the function doesn't give you the display of all of the unfolding processes. And so that's the kind of star structure you need, the both sides of the slash for that. So that would be, I think, how it would apply to causation in these systems. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wolfgang?
Oh, yes, thank you. I wanted to ask about autopoietic systems as autonomous. And if I noted correctly, you described this in the sense that they subordinate all changes to the maintenance of their own organization. And I was thinking of the example of a caterpillar and its transformation to a butterfly. I was wondering if that's, in which ways does this, the principle of autonomy and maintaining its own organization hold or not? Or is it a special case, or is it just, maybe it's very simple? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think cases like that are actually really important because there are all sorts of transformations across life cycles where things like that happen. And I think the general statement that they're making is that when you have a system that's autopoietic, any structural change that it undergoes needs to happen in such a way that the autopoietic organization is preserved. So the autopoietic organization has to remain invariant. Now, I mean, in the caterpillar and the butterfly, we're dealing with, of course, questions. It's a multicellular organism. Is it an autopoietic system of the first order? Is it a second order? Like, is it autonomous? Like, you know, leaving those questions out, which are actually quite difficult. The general point would be that the living system, in order to be living, where living is defined in terms of the autopoietic organization, has to keep that organization, though the structural realization of that can change in all sorts of ways, and indeed does change hugely for certain organisms across the life cycle. Yeah. But there's a way in which, so this is related to this idea of adaptivity that Ezekiel de Paulo introduces. There's a way in which autopoiesis as the paradigm of autonomy in the classical autopoietic literature is an all or nothing notion. A system either is autopoietic or it isn't. It either realizes the living organization or it doesn't. And any situation of precariousness where it's, as it were, running down and in danger of losing the organization, as an observer would describe it from the outside, really doesn't count as a graded change. It's just a question of, is it still autopoietic or is it not? And how do we mark the difference? So it's a kind of all or nothing, you know, life plus sign, death in the sense of cessation of autopoiesis minus sign. And there's no real conceptual resources for dealing with indeterminate or graded cases where we want to talk about the system. See, it's immediately tempting to introduce teleological language here, which is one reason why they avoid this, where we want to say things like the system is, as it were, you know, striving or making an effort to stave off tendencies that will lead to its death or its dissolution, and it's in this, you know, realm of precarity, or it's, you know, it's being buffeted in its tendencies this way or that way. The concept of adaptivity is really what's required to talk about that, and autopoiesis in its bare bones logic doesn't actually give us that. And so that, you know, that's what you need to talk about changes in life cycle. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Jose?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I have a question about this idea of self-individuation entailed by the autopoietic organization. And I was wondering, can we really define this in an observer, a truly observer-independent manner? Because if I have, let's say, a simulation in a computer, I simulate an autopoietic system and I see there's a boundary that emerges, or I could define the boundary in a very abstract way. It doesn't matter. I mean, it could be like a boundary, whatever. And then in that case, we would say, well, this is observer dependent, right? There's somebody sitting in front of the computer interpreting these pixels as a boundary.
Right.
But what's the difference when I observe, say, the same implementation at a molecular level? Say, I see like real autopoietic system implemented by molecules. And I would say, in one case, we would say, well, that's not really observer dependent because it's the system itself that is creating itself and so on. But is there really a difference? I mean, this is the point where I lose the discussion with my colleagues, to be honest. I don't know if you have something.
So I would say, or let me put it this way, I hear two different issues or questions folded into your one question. So, I mean, there's a general question about the status of simulations or computational models or computational instantiations of phenomena, whatever they be, whether they be, living phenomena or, the weather, or, there's a general issue about the status of computational models in relationship to what they model, whether they simulate or whether they also realize in some sense what they're simulating. So that's one issue. And then there's an issue about whether, this is an issue that arises in the context of cybernetics and second generation cybernetics. There's an issue about the status of the observer in relationship to the system that the observer indicates through some, to use Spencer Brown's terminology, through some, mark or act of distinction. Now, in the second case, the way that autonomy comes into the discussion is that the notion of autonomy, at least traditionally, is meant to apply to systems that govern themselves. So they assert and govern themselves and constitute themselves. And that means that their identity is not a matter of outside conventional stipulation. There is a question about whether from the outside they are recognized in their identity or not, but their identity is not supposed to be merely conventional. So there's this is the sense in which, when I pick up my iPhone and interact with it, it can perform all sorts of functions, but it's very different from when I interact with a mouse that's, scurrying around my living room, or, I interact with, a bird on the beach. Those systems, act and react back to me in a way that then we theorize or conceptualize in terms of an idea of autonomy that then as biologists we want to try to unpack. So one issue is about, okay, well, still you're interacting with that mouse and you perceive it as a mouse, as a discrete, organism or entity running about the room. And that depends on your perceptual capacities and your ability to make distinctions. So you're there as an observer. So you can't just remove yourself from the story. I mean, there's a sense in which that's true, but it would be odd to say that, the being of the mouse just depends on the fact that I have a concept of a mouse, or that I'm able to, mark a distinction between mouse and not mouse. And so that's, where autonomy and autopoiesis then enter into the story. And then, of course, they get recursively applied to the observer. And so then it's the idea that, okay, well, the observer too, is autonomous, and we get a sort of reiteration. So there's like a whole question of issues about the like ontological status of systems, particularly autonomous ones, in relationship to conventions of individuation. But that's really then a different issue from the issue about, I think, what's the status of computer models in relationship to what they're modeling. I think, in the case of autopoiesis, Francisco very early on worked on these, tessellation automata, two-dimensional cellular automata models of autopoiesis. And, I don't think he ever thought, I think he always thought of them as simulations and models, not as realizations of autopoiesis in a computational space. I don't think he would have been happy with that way of looking at it, because I think he would say that the kind of the presence of the observers required in a much stronger sense for the computational model, because you need both syntactic and semantic mappings that the observer has to provide. You need the observer to say, here's, what syntactically and semantically counts as the grid and the on-off states. And if you take away those mappings, you just have, physical electronic, transitions and processes happening in the computer, and you don't have any model anymore. So I think he would see a kind of difference in kind there between a model of autopoiesis in the computational domain and the physical realization of autopoiesis in the biochemical domain. It's not that you couldn't try to challenge that. People have challenged that, but I think that's how he would have thought of it. I don't know if that helps with the question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Murillo?
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't find the raise your hand button this time.
I saw the hand. So.
Hi, Evan. It's always really good to hear you talk. I'm still confused if I'm allowed to say that the mouse running in your flat is an autonomous system, if it is an autopoietic system of first order, second order. And I was hoping that today with your talk, we could clarify if we are allowed to say animals are autonomous systems. Because if these, we're discussing these concepts in the context of defining what a living system is, what distinguishes an organism from something that is not an organism. And I feel like we're still not quite clear about that. That's my first question. I'll then see if others have other questions, and I have two others to follow up.
Okay.
Thanks.
I would say there's no, within the criteria of the theory of autonomous systems, there's no problem in saying an animal is an autonomous system. The question is, or one question is whether, so it's an autonomous system, its constituents are autopoietic systems. There is a question about whether the animal as a whole is itself a first order autopoietic system. That is, can we identify components that satisfy the precise production and specification relations of the autopoietic definition at the level of the whole animal? That's not so clear. In the cell, we point to, enzymes and catalysis and, the membrane and, molecular processes of synthesis and destruction and all of that. It's not immediately obvious exactly what we would, all those things, of course, going on in the animal too, but to make it a first order autopoietic system, it's not exactly clear what the first order constituent autopoietic processes are going to be. So then we might say, well, it's a second order autopoietic system where it does have, most animals have that kind of, topological boundary membrane, and they have systems that constitute that kind of bounded internal self-production that depend on first order autopoietic systems. So we might say it's a second order autopoietic system, but still we would have to get precise and figure out exactly, what it is we're talking about. And then, of course, there are constituent systems like the nervous system and the immune system, which Francisco certainly treated as autonomous systems, that are coupled to each other within the body in complicated ways. So there's a program of research in which, yes, the animal, the metazoan, the multicellular organism with a nervous system, is productively modeled in the terms of autonomy. But again, specifying the exact details of that is work that needs to be done. So that's, I think, how he would think of it. Yes, it's fine. Of course, it's an autonomous system, but fleshing that out in terms of specific networks, and then the way that autopoiesis at different levels constitutes that's a lot more tricky. And then, of course, there's the animal really has to be understood in terms of its whole life cycle. And many animals, change hugely through their life cycles, like the butterfly and the caterpillar. And some of those, phases may involve certain kinds of stasis and hibernation and all sorts of things. So, there's going to be all sorts of more detailed structural considerations that are going to arise for any case. But in very general terms, yes, animals would be autonomous systems. I don't think that would be in dispute.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are, I saw before again, Chris, but I don't know if other people. So maybe, I saw Carlson.
Bruno,
maybe?
is there? Bruno has his hand up.
Oh, Bruce, yes, Bruno.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. Nice to see you, and happy to be back after some travels that kept me away from joining the group. Let me zero in on the last, the paper that you brought to our attention at the end was one I was not familiar with. The reflections on the circulation of concepts between a biology of cognition and systemic family therapy. This caught my attention because the family therapists were a very avid group receiving second-order cybernetics, and the group around Heinz von Förster. And Heinz then would often be invited to speak to the family therapists. Of course, Bateson was also in that particular milieu. So it was curious to me if I understand, because it seems to me that what Varela is saying here kind of runs counter to the normal understanding of second-order cybernetics, which in a nutshell is that the first-order cybernetics, the observer was modeled as exterior to the system and right, but the reflexive turn to get second-order cybernetics was the inclusion of the observer in the system to be observed. And here's Varela seeming to say, but actually that doesn't precisely work. Or if you include the observer in the system, you lose the system that you're observing. I'm just curious what you make of Varela's gambit here, or whether he is in fact kind of codifying a sort of a critique of what otherwise people think of as second order cybernetics.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the second order cybernetics is a complicated terrain, and it might depend on exactly who we're talking about. Von Förster and Bateson, I think, probably both may have versions of what Francisco is saying here. In other words, they're not doing what somebody like Niklas Luhmann apparently does, which is to say, we can really take these systems concepts and apply them to human sociality and ground, social theory, social science on these concepts in a way that makes it rigorous and scientific. So, Bateson and von Förster are quite subtle and complicated in the way that they, see the necessity of the second order cybernetic turn, where the observer gets included into the the performance of the distinction that marks out something as a system. And they're quite, especially von Forster, sophisticated in thinking about the sort of inherent self-referentiality and reflexivity that comes into play there, in a way that I would see as different from some theorists like Luhmann, who take these system concepts in a somewhat different way. But Francisco, it seems to me, is doing something still further than that, which, so I would, although he wrote this paper in 1989 or published it in 1989, I would see it maybe somewhat with a kind of maybe arguably illusion of hindsight in light of his later work, as really making a kind of philosophical point that we really see taken up in phenomenology, which is the idea that there are certain domains in which you can bracket your positionality to a limited extent, and then there are other domains in which it becomes inherently problematic. So, I mean, this particularly emerges in thinking about consciousness when he works on consciousness. Any study or characterization of consciousness is always from within the horizon, the field of consciousness as lived experience. And there's a way in which I am inclined to read this statement as almost like a foreshadowing of that we are always, or another connection here, actually, Francisco was always, even when he was very young, influenced by, thinkers like, Heidegger, existential phenomenologists. So in that register, there's always a way in which we're sort of thrown into our, being with others, our being in the world, our sociality, and we can never step outside that. So when you try to make that the focus, the very act of making it the focus already is a social act that has social consequences and is subject to norms. And I do see that maybe as a Francisco's an unusual thinker with all these different sort of threads of influence in the sort of tapestry of his thought. And I do see that in a way as maybe marking a different strand or line of influence in his thinking that you could just recover completely from second order cybernetics, and that would differentiate him even from second order cybernetic thinkers like von Forster and Bateson. It's the I don't know what to call it. It's like the existentiality of it, you might say, or in a sort of phenomenological language, you would say it has to do with his becoming increasingly sensitive to the need for a transcendental perspective and not a simple, straightforward empirical one. Francisco, I don't say this as a criticism, but I mean, he wasn't a philosopher, so he didn't have the sort of, the compulsion, at least that I feel as a philosopher, to always try to figure out how all these things relate to each other and see if I can make them coherent. He wasn't really bothered by that. He would work with ideas and let them take him where they needed to in terms of the questions he was currently asking, and to my knowledge didn't ever really I mean, maybe Amy would have a different view of this, or know some other things here, but didn't really retrospectively return to explicitly ask the question, okay, now what's the relationship between the phenomenological project and the second order cybernetic project? How do I see these in historical relationship to each other in terms of my own thought? I never had a conversation with him in which he posed it explicitly that way. But maybe he did with other people.
Well,
that was
thanks.
a long answer. I'm not sure.
I'm going to pull this paper down and maybe the paper in the fullness of the paper will.
Yeah, I mean, just to say about that paper, I mean, that paper was, again, it's an instance of what I'm just saying. It's like an occasional paper. He wrote it because he was invited by the family therapists to contribute. And it came from a meeting that he had with them in which he expressed, on the one hand, his happiness to see that these concepts were being taken up and given a life by others. At the same time, his strong reservations about using these concepts applied to human social interactions in that way. So it's an expression of an ambivalence too, in a way.
Thank you very much. I saw that Georgina posted a question. I don't know if Georgina, you want to intervene directly?
Oh, yes, see this in the chat.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ivan, for your great talk. Well, I have a question. Well, this is regarding a figure that I attached here in the chat. So I was reading this paper from Arandia and Di Paolo that is called Placebo from an Enactive Perspective. And in this figure, they divide what they call dimensions of embodiment as organic, sensorimotor, and intersubjective. So my question is, can we use, instead of dimensions of embodiment, can we use levels of autonomy as equivalent?
Right. I would be not inclined to line them up that way. So the dimensions of embodiment, actually, that's a framework that that Francisco and I introduced in the paper we did on neural dynamics and consciousness called Radical Embodiment that we published in 2001. So we have this distinction of dimensions of embodiment where we have the basic bodily organic, we have the sensory motor, and we have the intersubjective. And I would have to go back and look at the Arandia and Di Paolo paper to see if they're drawing specifically on that or whether they're just introducing it themselves. But I would not see that as equivalent to levels of autonomy because I think the way I would look at it is that, we have organic phenomena, we have sensory motor phenomena, and we have intersubjective phenomena. And then the idea of an autonomous system is a conceptual theoretical model that we can apply to illuminate different aspects of sensory motor embodiment, different aspects of organic embodiment, different aspects of intersubjective embodiment. But I wouldn't want to equate them. So I see them as having like logically different statuses. The organic, sensory motor, intersubjective are terms for very complicated and interwoven domains of phenomena. And the concept of autonomy in terms of organizational operational closure, that's a concept that belongs to a model in which you then try to specify some subset of phenomena in these dimensions in terms of the model. That's how I would look at it anyway.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Other questions? I saw before, maybe Chris wanted to pose another question. We have time, I think, for one question. 2 minutes.
So going back to your presentation, and maybe this is a little oversimplistic, but with your analysis of necessary and sufficient conditions, it seems to me that's what's happening is that when you add sense making, you're just going from the model as abstract and actually now putting it into a lived situation. It's giving it a history of interactions. And once you do that, you naturalize the system, and then you give it a trajectory, you give it a teleology. And I see it as analogous to looking at structural coupling in abstraction as a model, as a theory, and then moving into, to use the term, conversational domain, right? Where you have necessarily this entire history of the system and the history of the environment. And is that what's happening there? I mean,
so when I was using necessary and sufficient, I really meant it in terms of the logic of how the concepts apply. So if we say we want to understand living systems as unities that are self-governing or self-regulating and that make sense of their environments. So we want to understand them as sense-making unities. Then we need conceptual tools for doing that in a way that we can relate, say, to biology and to systems theory. So then the conceptual tool that we get initially is the idea of organizational closure. And in the way that Varela then applies that conceptual tool in terms of its logic, he says, on the one hand, he says it's necessary for autonomy, for you know, a sense-making unity. That seems right. But then he says it's equivalent. And so necessity and equivalence are two different things logically, where equivalence would entail that it's not just necessary, but it's also sufficient. And then that doesn't seem to be right, because mere organizational closure does not seem to be enough, not sufficient for the sense-making capacities of living unities. And then the question becomes, okay, so what conceptual tool do we need for that? And that's then where we appeal to adaptivity. Not in terms of like a sort of external plugin, like here's an adaptive, you know, monitoring, regulating sort of function, but we say, no, it's part of the way that the system is organizationally closed, that it's adaptively organizationally closed in terms of how it can alter structurally its organizational closure in relation to its viability boundary. So that's sort of the logic that I see there.
So thank you very much. I think we are already a bit after 8, so maybe I think we have to close here our Q&A session. We would really like to thank you so much for your generous presence here this evening, for your talk and for your generosity in answering the questions. Really, it was fantastic. We are very, very happy, I see, also from the participants. So thank you again so much.
Thank you, and it's good to see familiar faces and new faces too, of course. It's good to see new faces, but very happy to see Alejandra and Lenore. I haven't seen either one of them in so long. It's wonderful to see even just the Zoom squares.
So, thank you very much again. So we will have our next and last session for this genealogy season on the 7th of December. In which will be a session dedicated mainly to discussion. We will invite also our speakers, and we hope to have a very intense discussion. We already today, we had a lot of connection to the next season, so we are already there to see. We are seeing this as a closure that is a new beginning for us. And so I hope to see you on the 7th of December. Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.